Good afternoon or morning, whichever it is. Hang on one second, I'll get all the settings right, maybe. We'll see. Oh, excuse me.
Se me olvida because I'm not every day.
Yeah, afternoon soon. All right, there, I'm official. Sorry. I don't know how I got distracted. Came on a little late there, sorry. But we still have time, 2 minutes. And I'm checking you guys off. I crossed somebody's name off last time. Oh, I think maybe I figured out what I'm doing wrong. No, I haven't. Gotta check something really quick. One of you's not on my roll, but you could have been added since yesterday. Let me check really quick. This may take a sec. Crud, I thought I just checked that this morning too. Logging in. Oh, crud. I think I'm recording all this too. That's cool. I can live with that, right? Poop. All right, so close to double checking on the roster. Yeah, there was a change on my earlier class roster too. I should have just reprinted probably. 1902, that's you guys. 12 o'clock. Okay. Yep, there it is. Okay.
Yeah.
Now,
are you gluten intolerant or?
uh-oh.
You know, I never really found out what was wrong with me.
Uh-oh. We're hearing stuff we probably don't want to hear, right? Although gluten intolerant, that's not, I mean, it's a hard thing, but not so bad. Okay. All right. I'm going to pause the recording. All right. Okay, we're official now. So hopefully all the stuff you needed to do for the first day you've done, which is figure out how you're going to get a book. Look online to make sure that you've gotten access to everything in Blackboard. How did I mute myself? How did that even happen? The most important pages on Blackboard probably are course documents, assignments, and syllabus. The calendar, when everything's due, is in the syllabus. If you were a little late or were figuring out lunch stuff. The reason that I put in AP exams really was to help the dual credit students to plan for things toward the end of the class, because there may be times that you think you can't do something for my class because you have an AP exam, but you have to do the thing for my class too. But it'll help you kind of work around your schedule. So I'm not expecting people in their 30s who have kids take, or 40s who have kids taking AP exams to also take them as well. So so syllabus has the calendar plus some extraneous things. Also has the book review assignment, and then course documents should have all of the weekly questions, the lecture notes, some course documents that are made from the book publisher, and my lecture notes. And then the assignment page should have most of the assignments on there already, ready to submit with the due dates posted. The only things that aren't on there are the quizzes. And then tomorrow at some point, I wouldn't expect it like 8 a.m., but before the end of the day, there should be a list of things for you to study for quiz number 1, which is not anytime soon. It's around Valentine's Day, but you know, you're reading the first chapter for quiz number 1. So, you know, maybe it's time for me to get the stuff up. All right, let me look for weekly question and notes, and then I'll share those things, and then we will get started. And let me know now and later too, if you happen to have any questions for today for this class. All right, so weekly questions, there we go, weekly questions. And then, yeah, that's not cool. I've got the quizzes that I was working on those. Kind of why I was behind logging on, kind of, probably other reasons too. Okay, lecture notes 15 through 17. I think that's where we're headed. Okay then, all right. I think I'm ready. I know you're going like, why weren't you ready before class started? I don't know, I'm sorry. Okay. So. Weekly questions, here we go. Okay, so the first weekly question, oh, this is one of my all-time favorite questions too. I ask this every year, whether it's an essay question. I love this question, so you better get this one. Yeah, do well on this. It's one of my favorite questions. Was Reconstruction a success or a failure, or was it something in between? In your response, consider land policy, key legislation during presidential and radical Reconstruction, Southern politics, racial and political violence, and Northern fatigue with Reconstruction. I know some of you are already saying, like, do I really have to talk about all those things? You know, if you talk about 2 or 3 of them really well with detail, you may have already filled up a page or 2. So, you know, it depends on how much detail you put in. But, you know, in the process, you'll talk about most of those things. And of course, always when somebody says, was it a success or failure, your job is to define how you see success or failure. Now, almost always true in a history class or any other class when they ask you was something good or bad, was it a success or failure? Usually the answer is yes. It was partially successful and partly a failure. Now, I will tell you, because I know everyone always wants to know my opinion. For me, Reconstruction, of course, is both success and a failure. Oh, somebody else is ordering there.
I can't eat.
Oh, and sneezing. God bless you. I'm trying to mute them. There we go. Okay. All right, sneeze away. But for the success and failure part, find stuff that you look at and you go, I mean, I don't know how you could say you could, and you could absolutely argue it and be successful. So don't take that the wrong way. But I don't know how, I wouldn't say that the Reconstruction is a complete failure because we get some pretty important amendments out of the deal. Now, I also understand that we don't enforce those amendments. I mean, this is my job. I teach history for a living, so I understand it. Oh, but the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments are important, whether we use them to their fullest potential at that time or not, because later on, we're going to use them for the civil rights movement. They'll be the basis of some important Supreme Court decisions. So it's kind of that, we didn't use it the way we should have, but it's going to be a super important, crucial tool for later. Also, you're going to notice that there are going to be some very important people who emerge out of Reconstruction, African-American leaders in particular, who are crucial to change over time and change during that time period. So, you know, if you can't recognize the importance of some of those guys, then, you know, that's kind of a problem. However, I do recognize that overall, Reconstruction did not bring equality for former slaves, and we all know this. So, I mean, whether we know it historically or instinctively, there's the reason we have a civil rights movement later, and there's a reason there's still concerns about racial and other issues of inequality. But, okay, all right. So that's my little speech about that question. Also, here's some other stuff that people always ask. Are you ready? Oh, somebody's coming in. Hang on. Here's the question people always ask that you should never ask, okay? Take a note on this. How long should my answer be? Don't ever ask that question. Don't do it. I know everybody wants to know that answer, but let someone else ask it, because someone always asks it. I'm just doing it for you to get it out of the way, and so none of you have to ask a really bad question to your college professor. Here's what your college professor hears when you say, how long does my answer have to be? This is what I hear. What's the least amount of work I can possibly do? That goes right into my ear. That may or may not be what you mean, but that's what we hear. I would say that typically people write about a page. Yeah, like typed up about a page. Yeah, I know. That is really what I hear. But I also did a sample answer for you. So maybe that will help. But what I'm looking for are a couple things. One, are you answering the question? That's always good. And two, are you putting in some detail that shows that you learned something? Something, well, no one's ever asked what's the most I can write. Yeah. Although on the book review, every once in a while, I'll have somebody that writes one that's twice as long as it's supposed to be. And to be very frank, that usually means you're a really bad writer. No offense at all, but it's like if you can't be more concise, that's a problem too. But I'm going to make a sexist comment. I will do this from time to time. The people who typically make I want to write one paragraph and it'll be good enough, that's almost always guys. What's up with you guys? Just a few more words, a little more detail. Come on. Okay, not always guys, but sometimes. And it's typically you math science people. You know how you are. Okay, all right, I'm done making sexist maybe not, probably. Okay, but I'm thinking about a page. Make sure you answer in some detail, and I'm looking for proof that I'm looking for proof that you learned something. That's our goal here, is that you learned something that you didn't know before. So don't write stuff about, the inauguration yesterday, although it was lovely and interesting and historic and all that stuff. Don't write blacks and whites aren't treated fairly even to this day. And also, one of the weird things that we get a lot in conclusions is, and without this, we wouldn't be the country we are today, or this event changed history forever. It's like, yeah, probably. But yeah, don't make that your conclusion. All right. So sorry for the sexist comment, but we'll look for some more. We'll see if I have any more. I always do. I'm almost always kidding though. I should tell you that ahead of time, and I'll try to be more careful. We get less careful as we get older sometimes. Yeah, no, and you can also absolutely no, if you write about the good or the bad and then how that shaped what is today, if you say something specific about what is today, that's way better than, and this changed history forever, or we wouldn't be the country we are today without it. Be specific. That really is what I'm looking for. You're absolutely right about that. That's always cool. All right. Yeah, when I taught high school pretty exclusively, I would make sexist comments a lot just to see if people were paying attention, which sometimes they were. And one day a guy got really angry with me and started screaming, it's like, it's not my fault you hate men. You need to cut that out. And I went, I'm really sorry. I was just kidding. I got a husband. I got 3 brothers. I got a dad. I like all of them. So sorry. Okay. All right. What I don't necessarily like is Reconstruction. Although there's a lot of promise in Reconstruction, it just doesn't really fulfill, what it's supposed to fulfill. Well, 16-year-old guys, it's a hard time. Okay, somebody's comment about the guy being sensitive. All right, Civil War. Okay. Our basic overview of the Civil War. I assume that you've either had 1301 or you have just a general idea of the Civil War. Pretty much North versus South. I know there's 4 states kind of stuck in the middle that sided with the North, but have some slaves, at least through the first half of the Civil War, until the Emancipation Proclamation, which I know didn't free those slaves, but you know, those states went, oh crap, if he's freeing the slaves, I guess we're going to have to get rid of our slaves. That's not a direct quote, of course. So then they started gradual emancipation. So by the time the Civil War is over, you've got the 13th Amendment, which ends slavery. And you've got the period of reconstructions where we're putting the North and the South back together. And if you're expecting that to go well, you're not, yeah, this will be news to you, but you know that it probably didn't. I mean, we don't always go back together well after a presidential election, which is not even close to a civil war, even though I know last week, it's not pretty. But the South, I'm going to say, is in worse shape than the North at the end of the Civil War, because it's where most of the war was fought, because a larger percentage of their population was harmed, killed, or their property was damaged. And well, they lost. You know, if you lose the war, you're usually in worse shape than the side. Oh, crud. Forgot to unplug my phone, didn't I? You're usually in worse shape than the side that won the war. Here are some ways that things went poorly for the South. Their economy is going to be changed to a large degree. And that's not really going to be fixed for a very long time, I would argue, until after World War II, for a variety of reasons. Oh, sorry about the phone. But roads, bridges, parts of farms, that sort of thing were destroyed. Plus, the labor source is going to change in the South. Okay, I'm going to go and plug the phone really quick. Sorry. I think the only reason I have the phone still so I can unplug it during class. That's, yeah, okay. All right. Excuse me. Really bad allergies today. The economy, the South is pretty decimated, the terrain. And of course, the South had been, I mean, primarily made their money by selling cotton before the Civil War. And one of the things that happened, I'm laughing at your comments, one of the things that happened during the Civil War was a northern blockade of the coastline. So the South could not sell their cotton overseas. And if you're a big fan of the Civil War and have studied a lot, one of the weirdest things to me about the Civil War is that the guys that you really fought the Civil War for in the South, the plantation owners who really were benefiting from the system that provided slavery and other things, they kept growing cotton instead of switching to food, which might have been useful for the troops. And they couldn't sell their cotton overseas. So they started smuggling their cotton to the North. So it's like the whole reason you fought the war, to preserve those people's economic benefit. And then these people won't even grow food for you, but whatever. Okay. But it destroys the Southern economy because those nations, primarily England and France, who bought the cotton from the South said, you know what, other people grow cotton. And they started buying cotton from other places. And then, of course, England, because you've studied world history, they just start taking over those other places. So then that cotton's really cheap. So you get cotton from Egypt, from India, from Venezuela. There are a couple other places that you can get it besides the United States. Now, I know, the North starts having more textile factories, so the South can sell their cotton to the North at this point, and it integrates the economy, but they never again have like 85, 90% of the international or global cotton market. So it's not, there's no more king cotton, is what I'm trying to say. Okay. All right. And then the Southern labor force is going to have to change because maybe plantation owners, maybe they will pay maybe they'll have to pay the slaves, but they find a way around that, of course. You know, the law lets them. And federally financed reconstruction does occur. So the North is going to pay some money to fix some stuff in the South. There'll be a lot of government contracts. And what you see historically is if there's government contracts, what you're going to end up seeing, yeah, maybe they should have grown rice. Although there is some rice that's grown in Georgia, South Carolina, and Texas along the coastlines, and Louisiana too, the marshier areas. But I know what you're saying. And you know, there are people, you know, because you're asking these good questions. You know that there are people in the South who work really hard to try to get the economy to change. Like, we've got to grow stuff other than cotton. Of course, my heroic fellow, George Washington Carver, is from near my hometown. And he's like, dude, grow some peanuts or sweet potatoes. And they go like, no. It's like, we don't even care that you're brilliant. We're not doing it. So the South doesn't change their economy and doesn't really diversify the agricultural part of their economy until the 20th century. And initially they start to do it because the boll weevil, B-O-L-L, weevil, is a little bug that eats up the cotton, destroyed their cotton crops around the turn of the century. I'm talking 1900. And one of the schools I taught at, and 100 years ago, their mascot was the boll weevil. Like, and their high school, I taught at a middle school, and their high school mascot, and I'm not kidding, and I hope they've changed this, I haven't looked, was the cotton pickers. Oh, dear Lord. Okay, all right, back to business. But there are going to be some government contracts in the South, which anytime you see the government handing out a lot of money, you sometimes see corruption following that as well. And we've seen that. I don't know if you know how much news you watch. It's hard not to watch news right now. But one of the states, California, didn't have as many rules about how to get unemployment benefits. So it turns out a bunch of people were kind of scamming. There was some guy who even wrote a song about it, about how you don't even have to work in California. The notes are on Blackboard. Yep. So. Okay. In the course documents page, it should say lecture notes 15 through 17, something like that. Yeah. Okay. All right. But goodness, yeah, scamming. All right. And scamming was a thing back then. You know, people scam when they can. It wasn't as big a thing because they didn't have the internet. The internet helps you with scamming. All right. Plantation owners might have to do some manual labor, scalawags and carpetbaggers. People who cooperated with these northern sponsored governments in the South were usually not thought of in a kind way. I'll tell you about more scamming in a sec. So the scalawags are people from the South who cooperated with northern sponsored government during this time period, primarily so they could get contracts and make some money. And these were people who were probably more businessmen than plantation owners before the Civil War. And carpetbaggers would be folks from the North who come to the South to get these government contracts or work in schools, that sort of thing. So we occasionally say that people are carpetbaggers, although you probably don't hear that term as much. The last time I heard it in a big way in the news was when Hillary Clinton, after her husband's presidency, moved to New York and ran for Senate there. And people said she was a carpetbagger. A carpetbag in those days was a suitcase. So it just means you're not from here. And the complaint that we see most typically now in this area is all the bunch of California people moving here, trying to California our Texas. So that's kind of our modern version of carpetbagging, I suppose, I guess. All right. Scamming, okay. I think one of the biggest scams during that time period was the government provided pensions for Civil War widows and orphans. And you know, the documentation wasn't readily available back then, so a whole bunch of people applied, and they were paying Civil War pensions for like 100 years after the Civil War. So that's a really big scam during that time period, because you know, if the government's handing out free money, people go like, well, I'm entitled because someone paid taxes. And this was a time period when they didn't even have federal income tax. So most people honestly didn't directly pay taxes. Most of their taxes were import and export taxes. So I know everybody pays stuff when they buy. Okay. I do mention here that you should probably know who scalawags and carpetbaggers are. So just remember, scalawags are Southerners who help with the Northern sponsored governments, and carpetbaggers are Northerners who come in to try to get money from the government programs and contracts. They may want to get a contract to rebuild a bridge or something like that. So just know the difference and why people hated them. Okay. Changes for former slaves. Well, they're not slaves anymore. That's the big change. 13th Amendment and slavery. There's a plan that is discussed, kind of initiated, and then taken back after Abraham Lincoln's assassination to redistribute plantation land and give every slave or every slave family 40 acres and a mule. Part of what the, why can I not think of what I was going to say there? Part of what the Freedmen's Bureau, yeah, was going to do, but they don't, because the federal government says no. Now, they did have kind of a pilot program for this that happened under General Sherman, whose name you can never say in Georgia because he kind of burned Georgia. So they would surrender, and they're still mad about that. But he was able to capture some land in South Carolina and Georgia, mostly South Carolina off the islands, and then turn that into farmland, or not turn it into farmland, but split it up among the slaves. And they ran the farms for a couple of years, you know, very profitably. But then when the war is over, yep, Sherman's March to the Sea. When the war is over and Johnson becomes president, who's notably Southern, he says, hey, let's not redistribute plantation land. So they, and he's not the only one who felt that way. I understand not everything happens just because the president wants it. The Freedmen's Bureau is also supposed to reunite slave families that have been separated. They do a pretty good job of that. Teach former slaves basic literacy. They do a pretty good job of that. Of course, basic literacy during that era is very basic because most people in the South don't go to school at all. If you're poor, you don't go to school in the South because they don't have mandatory school attendance, because they don't have tax bases to pay for public schools. Yeah, the way they pay for public school in the South is different than in the North. And in the North, a lot of times they plan that into their state government. They may even have a commission of education in their state government. That doesn't happen in the South for a long time. And then maybe some basic medical care, but the medical care, again, it's the 1860s and 70s. So a lot of times you don't want the medical care. You're probably better off without it. But they did start to learn a lot of things about basic sanitation because of the Civil War and having large groups of people together, especially large groups of injured people together. So medical care a lot of times is just basic sanitation during that time period. When you should clean, what you should clean with, that sort of thing. Okay, you definitely want to know the amendments that are passed during this time period, referred to as the Civil War amendments, 13, 14, and 15. Okay. Yes. 13th. Yep, you can read the whole thing. And the 14th Amendment, as somebody's already putting in the comments, really was written the way it was written to reverse the Dred Scott case. Yeah, the Dred Scott case, if you don't remember that from 1301, that case essentially said that if you're Black, you can't be a citizen. So the 14th Amendment's intention was to make everyone who was born here a citizen, regardless race, ethnicity, that sort of stuff. If you were born here, you're a citizen. Yeah, okay. All right, so 13th Amendment ends hereditary slavery. You can still be forced to work if you're imprisoned, that sort of thing. And this will lead to the rise of private prisons, especially in chain gangs and work details and stuff, which you'll see in a really big way right after the Civil War. And then you see again in another big way during the Great Depression. People get arrested and imprisoned for all kinds of stuff usually like stealing food during the Great Depression, especially in the South and the Midwest, and then they put them in jail and use them as labor. And when you see that happening right after the Civil War, it is primarily African Americans. And when you see that during the Great Depression, they're a little more egalitarian about who they want to enslave through imprisonment. I'm not saying it isn't still more African Americans, but what you will notice if you study the history of jurisprudence in the country is you don't have money, things aren't going to go well for you at court. That's still kind of true. I know if you can't afford a lawyer, one will be provided for you, but that happens much later, and the free lawyer is not always as good as the one you pay lots of money for. And because race or ethnicity and poverty tend to overlap, that's an enormous problem if you're a person of color and poor. All right, more stuff. Okay, you guys are chatting it up. I know you are. Let me look. Okay. Yeah, somebody's a big fan of the 13th Amendment. Good job. No, it's good. I like that you come in with so much knowledge. That's cool. The 14th Amendment is supposed to make everyone who's born here a slave. Oh, I just said that. It's supposed to make everyone who's born here a citizen. The Dred Scott case, Dred Scott was a slave who had lived in a whole bunch of places, and his owner was an army doctor, and he got stationed at a bunch of different army bases, some of them in states where slavery was not legal. When the owner died, he got willed to a couple of different relatives, one of whom's an abolitionist who goes like, nope. And he sort of makes a deal and says like, hey, before I get my freedom, because I know you don't want to own me, can I sue for my freedom? Hoping they would establish a precedent that if you were a slave but had ever lived in a free state, that you would be freed. And the Supreme Court, that's incredibly pro-Southern during that time period, says, Dred Scott's not even a citizen because he's Black, not because he's a slave, but because he's Black, which establishes the idea that if you're Black, not the idea, the precedent set by the Supreme Court, that if you're Black, you're not a citizen and not entitled to the protections of citizenship. And they also said that no state has the right to regulate slavery. And of course, this is happening in the 1850s, late 1850s, when some other stuff's happening that, yeah, is leading to a civil war. Yeah. Yeah. All right. No, you guys are doing well on the 1301 stuff. This is really supposed to be more of a warm up, but you guys are ready. I can see it. I can see it. And the 15th Amendment says that all citizens can vote, but it really means all men. There'll be some women who go to vote and they get arrested, which establishes the idea that women don't get to vote, which is going to lead to a really ugly split in the women's rights movement, which had been really kind of grown out of the anti-slavery movement, the abolition movement, because a lot of the same people wanted, you know, more freedoms for women and slavery for and the end of slavery. And so the women's rights movement will split into two groups, one that says the 15th Amendment's bogus because they should have let women vote along with men, and another part that says, no, the 15th Amendment's cool, we just need to add another amendment for women. But the people who said the 15th Amendment was bogus, they're going to say some super racist things. Primarily, I'll just clean this up for you. Why would you let stupid Black men vote before you would let educated white women vote? Yeah. And that's the cleaned up version. And that's going to cause, you know, bad moments for feminist history and some hard feelings between people who had worked together in the abolition movement and the women's rights movement. So, yeah. Yeah. And we'll get to talk more about that later. All right. So plantation labor is over. But to me, biggest failure of Reconstruction, which continues to cause us problems to this day and would lead to an incredibly controversial argument if we wanted to have it, which we probably don't at this moment, but is when we free slaves, when the country frees slaves, we, like I was there. I was definitely not. I'm pretty old, but not that old. When the country frees the slaves, they're freed and they're broke. And they have worked their entire lives, as have their parents and grandparents, without being paid. So they've been robbed of their labor generationally for as long as their families have been in the United States, which could be before we had the United States. So this is generational theft. So when you're free, but you're broke, it does give you new opportunities, but it also means you're broke. And there are things you have to have. You know, they say money doesn't buy happiness, but it does pay the rent and it pays for dinner. You need a place to live and you need food. Well, former slave owners understand that they're kind of in the director's seat here, and they say, you know what? It's cool that you're free, but we know you're broke and you don't have money to travel somewhere else, because there were places, a few like Western Kansas, that were giving out free land. But one, if you've ever been to Western Kansas, and two, it's a long trip. And to make a long trip is expensive. So you have to have money to relocate. So these guys said to their former slaves, hey, you know, congratulations on the whole freedom thing. It'd be cool if you had a place to live, wouldn't it? And some tools to do your work, because those tools you're using, those are mine. And that place you're living, I also own that. And those clothes you have, I also paid for those. So if you want to stay here and work, that's cool. You can pay rent on your old slave quarters. And I know you don't have any money now, and I don't really have any money to give you, but as long as you work, when the crop comes in, we will share in the profits of the crop, hence share cropping. So I'll pay you then, and then you can pay me back for the rent and the tools and all that stuff with interest, of course, of course. And then the southern states start passing laws, especially for African Americans. They call those Jim Crow laws later on, that say like you have to have a 1-year labor contract with somebody. And if your boss mistreats you, you can go to court. But if you go to court in the South, the only witnesses can be white and male. So if you don't have the 1-year labor contract, or if you break it, then the police can arrest you and then charge you with vagrancy, and you either stay in jail and work for somebody, or you can go back and work for the person you were supposed to work for. So the sharecropping thing kept you in perpetual debt. And the crop lien system was for folks who owned a little bit of land, probably some crappy land, and maybe didn't have enough money to put in the crop, so they could borrow against the future value of their crop and then pay it back. It's sort of like a car title loan or a payday loan, which is pretty exciting stuff too. Because a lot of times you don't have the money to repay that, and you lose the collateral, the stuff you put up in promise of paying it back, which for them was the land. So if you're involved in the crop lien system, you're maybe a couple years away from being involved in sharecropping. And if you're involved in sharecropping, you're just broke and you're kind of stuck. So it's not to say that there weren't some people who were, yeah, no, this is bad stuff, goodness. It's not to say that there weren't people who rose out above that, and you're always going to find a handful of people that no matter how crappy the situation is, somehow they manage to get out of it. Yeah, but you know, that's always the thing people can look at and go like, well, if they got out of it, how come the rest? Because it's really hard. That's why the rest of the people didn't get out of it. Yeah. And generational theft and generational poverty are difficult obstacles to overcome and take generations. Yeah. Yeah, the sharecropping is definitely an early system of loans, which, and even in the modern era, when you borrow money, that always benefits the person you borrow from, unless it's a relative. And then, that's always dangerous. I know every once in a while, my husband and I would have a relative ask us, like, can we borrow money? And my husband and I had an understanding. We had many understandings. Good married people have a lot of understandings. And it was, you can't loan, personally, you can't loan money that you can't afford to lose, because if you loan money to your relatives, they rarely pay it back. I'm just saying. Otherwise, they would have gone, you know, to a bank. But, you know, crop lien system, sharecropping, this kind of stuff, this clearly benefited whoever owned the land, whoever was giving out the loan. And they weren't like your dad or your grandpa. They're going to demand repayment, and they will take your farm away. Yeah, darn, or put you in prison. Okay, do you guys have any questions thus far? You guys have been making some really interesting comments, which I'm trying not to be distracted by, but I have enjoyed. So, all right, we will get back to the political stuff. And if you're wondering like why the weird order, typically the weird order of my notes may follow the odd order of the chapter. And when you get your book or when you look at your book, you'll notice too, there's chapter headlines or section titles. Headlines, that's probably not the right word, but different section titles that kind of lead you where you're going to go to find the information that you need. So, you know, all the stuff, the whole chapter is really about Reconstruction, but there'll be different sections where you can look at more political stuff, more economic stuff. I would say too, when you're writing your answer about Reconstruction, there's certain things you just have to mention. Like, I'm sure the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments have to come up in some way in your answer because they're important. Now, whether we enforce them or not, that's a whole other story, and we're getting to that, but dang, okay. All right, so politics. Everything's gonna be fine, right, after the Civil War, because we got one of the greatest presidents in history. We have Abraham Lincoln, and the greatest speech ever, maybe, in political history is his second inaugural speech. It talks about malice toward none, charity toward all, right in the way that we see right, and we want to bind up the nation's wounds and take care of the widows and the orphans. And he starts off the speech because, you know, when he's giving the speech, the Civil War is not quite over, but it's just about over. And he says, you know, we can blame the South for this, but the North let slavery go on forever, and we knew it was wrong. So we're both paying for this because we both deserve it, the North and the South. So we can't act all self-righteous. Of course, he says it in a much more succinct and Lincoln-like way. And he quotes scripture a lot because that's what people did back then. It makes, yeah, it's a beautiful speech. And one of the reasons, like if you ever have to discuss a political speech, I would go with a Lincoln speech because we're really short. So I think he really understood the value of short speeches as well. But, you know, there's a lot of promise. It's like, you know, we're not going to punish the South, but we're going to bind up the nation's wounds. We're going to move forward towards freedom, more equity for people in, you know, an 1865 sort of way, which is, you know, it's fairly advanced for the time period, at least for Abraham Lincoln and the United States. I know it probably wouldn't look good to, it wouldn't look good to you now, but Lincoln still had a lot of political growth over his lifetime and has gone away from the idea that, yeah, slaves, we shouldn't have slaves, but blacks and whites probably shouldn't live together too. Nope, we should all live together, we should pay the soldiers the same, that sort of thing. Of course, he had a lot of persuasion from his friend Frederick Douglass, but Lincoln is the right guy at the right time. And then someone shoots the right guy at the right time. That John Wilkes Booth fellow who said that slavery was the greatest gift that God had ever given white men, which is primarily the reason that he killed Abraham Lincoln, because, you know, he ended slavery. And then Andrew Johnson becomes president, and Lincoln, God bless Abraham Lincoln, but here's kind of an interesting decision that he made. And I need you to think about this in case you ever become president. In the modern era, well, in any era, to be honest, after we passed an amendment that said that the president and vice president run as a ticket rather than, you know, the winner is president and second place is vice president. We did that for 2 or 3 elections and that doesn't work well. So can you imagine, you know, to have like Trump as president and Hillary Clinton as vice president, or Biden as president and Trump as vice president? That would be fascinating stuff, wouldn't it? But ever since presidents and vice presidents have run on a ticket, you pick the vice president to complement or add to something the president probably doesn't have, or to make some sort of statement. Usually in the modern era, it's to get voters that the president couldn't get. And I think you see that in a fairly big way with the last couple of presidential elections. I think Kamala Harris is going to shore up the younger, less old white guy vote. And I know, Biden gives speeches as a progressive fellow, but he has a record as a less than progressive fellow. So, he needed something else to help solidify the idea that he's a different person than he was in the 1980s or 90s, because he's been in politics forever. You may remember President Trump, and he picked a fellow named Mike Pence for his vice president, who goes to church every day, I'm pretty sure. He's like a super religious guy, because Trump, not so much. And a lot of times Republican voters are super religious people. So Trump needed to get the super religious guy vote. And the idea was that Pence would be the guy who would bring that along. So with Lincoln knows everybody. At this point, they're just about to win the Civil War. There's really nobody that's going to vote against him. The South isn't voting because, it's still the Civil War. It's 1864. But he wants to reward people who have been loyal to the Union. His vice president, Hannibal Hamlin, dies. So he's going to replace him with a new candidate, and he picks Andrew Johnson. Now, Andrew Johnson was from Tennessee, and you may or may not have noticed that Tennessee is not exactly in the north, but Andrew Johnson is the only Southern senator who opposed secession and continued to attend the Senate during the Civil War. So Lincoln wants to reward him for his loyalty to the country, to the Union. And he also wants to send a signal to the South that I think the war and death and poverty will be punishment enough for you. So we're going to work together. We're going to try to make things better. I mean, there's going to be some changes you don't like, but we're not going to come in and imprison you, take all your stuff. We're just going to, work toward equality. And since Johnson was in favor of the Union and didn't want to secede, going to reward him for that. And then the South says, oh, we're going to get the vice president. Now, the vice president doesn't do much. I mean, as a rule. Now, it'd be a little different maybe in the modern era, maybe, because they break tie votes in the Senate. That's kind of important. The president sends them to things that they don't want to attend, funerals, state trips they don't want to go on. And occasionally they give a speech. They open the Senate, they close the Senate, but they don't have a lot of power unless the president dies. We hadn't had a whole lot of president dying up until this point. So, oh God. Am I talking too much? Is it bothering you? I'm sorry. No, I'm teasing you. I know it's okay. It's a long time. So yeah, about 30 more minutes. But, and whenever, if you need to get up and walk around, I don't know. So yeah, do what you need to do. Yeah, and if your kid's crying, please, go talk to him. Or tell them a little history story. It'll be cool. And if you made that comment, no problem at all. You're good. I'm just teasing. No, and you've got to eat. I get it. I would be eating, except I'm the professor at Team 3. But I can't see you, so do whatever you need to do. But Andrew Johnson, okay, now we got him as president. And Andrew Johnson had said that he wished, I think his slavery quote is something like, every white family in America should have a slave to relieve the drudgery of daily life. So Johnson's problem with slavery is that not every family owned a slave. This is not going to be the right guy to be in charge after the Civil War. But of course, except I do think when your president's close to 80, he probably is picking somebody that he thinks can take over, just in case, because he's 80. But Lincoln was young. He'd lived through a lot of stuff. And yeah, this isn't going to be good. It's not at all. Okay. All right. Yeah. Well, and I will also say my perspective on the Civil War, it tends to, especially when I taught high school in the district that I taught in, most of them came from a middle school where they all taught they use something called History Alive, which is cool. I mean, because they reenacted a bunch of stuff, hopefully not too much slavery stuff or Civil War stuff, but they reenacted a lot of stuff, and they tried to make it really interesting to the kids. But they also had a couple of teachers who were Civil War reenactors, and they usually were Southern Civil War reenactors. So their take on the Civil War is much different than mine, and mostly emphasized the states' rights part. So when I would talk about Civil War Reconstruction, it was really frustrating to them, and they would tell me I was wrong, and I would tell them, I don't know, if I'm right or wrong, that's your decision, but what you've got to do is look at all of the facts and come to a conclusion that makes sense, that goes directly with most of the facts, which always makes me nervous about students who never read a book and don't check other outside sources. Because if your only source of history is me, or the guy who thinks the Civil War was not about slavery, you need more sources, always. More sources are better than fewer. But anyway, Andrew Johnson, I don't think anyone's going to say, no, that was a great president. So, even though that's an opinion-based thing, he's going to have some issues. So he's going to become president. And the Congress have been talking about how they were going to put the South back together after the Civil War, if they were going to punish the South pretty harshly, which was how the Congress was leaning. And one of the things that the Congress had passed was something called the Wade-Davis bill. And the Wade-Davis bill said that you can start voting again in your formerly Confederate state once 50%, is sometimes called the 50% plan, once 50% of your eligible voters say that they never voluntarily supported the Confederacy or secession. And that probably means you're going to have to wait a generation until you get voters who weren't eligible to vote to say that, to honestly say that. So Lincoln thought, what, that's too much. So he did something unusual called a pocket veto, which you can only do like in the last 2 weeks of a legislative session. Typically when the president doesn't sign a bill, it just goes into law without his permission. If the president doesn't want the bill to become a law, he's got to veto it, and then the Congress can vote. Do we override the veto, which takes a vote? But at the last 2 weeks of a session, because people tend to do more radical things at the beginning and at the end. And at the end, there's not as much recourse. So if you're the president and you don't sign a bill at the end of the legislative session, it just goes away. It doesn't become law. So Lincoln did the pocket veto. He said, you know what? We'll have a holiday. You'll go home for Christmas, New Year's. The war will be over, because it looked like that's where things were headed. And we'll come back and clearer heads will prevail. So we won't do the super harsh thing, and we'll talk about it when we get back. Well, of course, he didn't come back. So they don't have a Reconstruction plan devised. So the states are trying to decide the Southern states, who do we send back to Congress when Congress reconvenes? So they send a lot of representatives up to visit with Andrew Johnson. It's like, we love you from the South. You worked really hard. You rose out of poverty. We're impressed. Your wife's cute, whatever, to kind of butter him up. Because the plan really was to not allow former Confederates to participate in the new government. Then Andrew Johnson starts pardoning a lot of former Confederates, and then they show up for Congress. And Johnson says, nope, it's okay, I gave them permission. And then Congress says, nope, you don't get to decide who we seat and who we don't. So they refuse to seat them. They refuse to recognize the elections. And then it's really on between Congress and Andrew Johnson. And because it's on and there's no Southern votes, almost everybody's a Republican, and they're all very pro-North. They've just won the Civil War, and they may not be for equality, they're probably not, but they are dang mad at the South. So you're going to see the Republicans coalesce around the more radical leaders who are going to push for more equality, and the more moderate Republicans are going to go like, yes, whatever, just anything that's going to upset the South or cause problems for Andrew Johnson. And you're really not going to see any pushback. So you will see lots of bills vetoed and then overridden, you know, in a way that you'll never, well, I shouldn't say never, because if there's anything we could say about politics, never isn't it. The last 4-6 years have taught us that for sure. But there are lots and lots of vetoes that were overturned during this time period. And you see a kind of a war, if you will, a political war between the Congress and the president in a very strong way during this time period. So what the what the Congress decides is something called Radical or Military Reconstruction Act. It's the Reconstruction Act of, let me get the year right, 1867, I think it is. I think it's 67 by the time they pass it. But it sets up 5 military districts, and they'll be governed by northern governors, and none of those states get to hold their own elections until they ratify the 14th and 15th Amendment, which, if you're wondering, no southern state ever does. If you're wondering, like, why didn't they make them ratify the 13th? They took care of that before the Civil War ended. So, you know, they were out by choice, so they don't have a voice in the 13th, but now they have a coerced voice in the 14th and 15th. Now, during this era, you will later, a little after this era, you'll see some southern states who will argue that the 14th and 15th Amendments don't apply to them because they never ratified them. Now, no one in the modern era would do that because people would go like, how big of a racist are you? Yeah, at this point, it's been so long, just the idea of common law, they're under it. And, you know, even if you're a really big libertarian states' rights kind of person, I would not make the 14th, 15th Amendment argument ever. I just wouldn't do it because the implications are just ugly. And of course, the 14th Amendment's a little more controversial in the modern era because it's been applied to anyone who's born in the United States. So if your parents are not in the country legally, but you were born here, it gives you automatic citizenship. And people would argue, well, the original intent of the original intent, I mean, this was passed in the 1860s. So yeah, they definitely weren't intending that, but we've used it that way for so long. Then it goes back to the idea of common law. But okay, anyway, you didn't, you like, I don't care, just go on with the stuff. Sorry. But so the southern states never ratify the 14th and 15th Amendments. And then through all of Johnson's administration and then the 2 Grant administrations to follow, the southern states have governors that are appointed by the North. And they're in those 5 military districts. And most of the northern governors are Civil War generals, and they have pretty large assignments of troops to keep those districts, those 5 Reconstruction military districts, in line. On election day also, at least the first couple of rounds, the troops are there to make sure African-American men are able to vote. And then the southern states go, you know what? Locally, they're going to start, like in towns and counties and stuff, they'll start passing Black codes or Jim Crow laws that restrict the freedoms of African Americans. Now, some states will take those to court, and their state courts, your book talks about, I think, some laws in Oklahoma that get overturned by some Oklahoma territorial courts, because I know Oklahoma's not a state then. But when these cases make it to federal courts, pretty much that same Supreme Court that did the Dred Scott case, they're still there. So when those cases make it to the Supreme Court goes, no. 14th, 15th Amendment, that's a federal thing. The states, they don't really have to enforce it. Like, oh, okay. So when you have a Supreme Court that disagrees with the laws that are being passed, you've got some interesting things to look at there. So the Supreme Court is going to eventually uphold these Jim Crow Black Code restrictions that include things like, you can't travel in a mostly white town without written permission from a white guy, or you have to have a 1-year labor contract, or you'll be arrested, or which part of the town you can live in. And what you'll notice is that segregated towns or segregated neighborhoods really start to develop. Now in the South, because there aren't that many big cities, it really tends to be segregated towns. So there'll be a black town and then pretty close to that, a white town. And, you know, it's not, yeah, it's redlining, which you see in the larger cities. And that redlining thing, which is essentially, well, it's the idea that if you're of a certain race or ethnicity, there are only certain neighborhoods you can live in. And you'll see that continue really through the 1960s and 70s, even though it's not legal anymore after the 1950s. You'll see Supreme Court cases that change it in the 50s, but real estate agents will kind of continue those policies until they're forced not to, until they get sued, is kind of how that works. And you'll notice that as we get into the modern civil rights movement, that the law is kind of the foundation for change, but until people actually abide by and the law gets enforced, that, yeah, the law changing doesn't always matter. And a Supreme Court case, that only matters if the federal government's going to enforce it. So yeah, that's all tricky stuff. Yep. Sorry. Wasn't Monopoly originally made by, oh, you know, I don't know that. I just knew that Monopoly kind of showed up after the Great Depression, but I don't know. That's interesting. Sure. Okay. It's a ton of stuff I don't know. Thankfully, I do know some major stuff, so we're good. All right. So black codes form similar to slave codes, and in a lot of states, they did have slave codes because sometimes slaves did have some some autonomy, like on the weekend or something, they could go visit a relative on another plantation with permission and all this sort of stuff. So most states and local areas had slave codes. A lot of times they just scratched out slave and put black. Yeah. Northern people really wanted former slaves to vote. The reason they wanted former slaves to vote, I mean, I would love to ascribe the North to being really egalitarian and they want everybody to be equal. They want blacks and whites equal in the South. They don't want African Americans in the North. They don't, because they're not necessarily less racist, but they do see that there's a great value to having African Americans vote in the South because they are going to vote for the same people the North will vote for. So it will help Republicans win national elections. Now, don't misunderstand me because I'm not saying there weren't Republicans who didn't truly believe in equality. Abraham Lincoln eventually comes to that. Certainly, you know, William Lloyd Garrison and Frederick Douglass, who acts as a Republican and certainly was one and was appointed by Republican presidents to be an ambassador, that sort of thing. And oh goodness, the Speaker of the House and the guy that gets caned, Sumner, yeah, Charles Sumner. There were some really serious, we believe everyone's equal Republican leaders. And they were in very important positions in the Republican Party during the late 60s and early 70s. But as that group honestly dies and the next group of Republicans takes over, yeah, that's not the leadership opinion, and it's certainly not the rank and file opinion of the average Republican voter. The average Republican voter probably just wants to stick it to the South. And the best way to do that is to make sure black guys can vote in the South, because then whatever Republicans want in the North will also get passed in the South, or the Southern states will get reconstructed and they'll become Republican states. And I know some of you are going like, this doesn't even make sense, because in my understanding, African-American voters don't vote for Republicans. In the modern era, statistically correct. In this era, of course, they voted for Republicans because it's the party of Lincoln. Now that changes during the Great Depression. We'll talk about that when we get there. And if you're a Southern African-American male during this time period and you're voting, you're absolutely voting for Republicans. Now, once black men don't get to vote anymore in the South, then, you know, they just don't vote. And then when black men do get to vote again in the South, you're going to see them voting for Democrats, but that's not until 1960s. Yeah, large. That makes sense. Yeah, and you do see, yeah, the parties definitely are going to switch some stuff. You see, oh goodness, the political parties kind of complicated and kind of not, because we only have two parties. My very cynical view of politics is the goal of one party is to make sure the other party doesn't have as much power as they do. The goal of both parties is to make sure no third party emerges, because those two parties enjoy having power or at least being second, and they don't want to have to form coalitions like you see in some other governments. But that's just me being cynical, and the corporate part of each party, I think, kind of wants the same thing. But historically, you know, like before the Civil War, the Republicans definitely the party that wanted to end slavery, no doubt. And during Reconstructions, definitely, if there are people in power that want equality, they're Republicans. They are. That doesn't mean that every Republican wants equality, but the ones who do. And then when we get into the Civil Rights era, honestly, neither party's super excited about it, but on a national scale, the Democrats are the first to put civil rights in the era of Harry Truman into their national platform. And the South opposes it, and the South is primarily Democrats during that time period. So that's you'll see the Democrats in the South kind of slowly get out of power, and then the Republicans come into power. Now, neither party wants to claim the racists, but that would be when most of you would say, well, that's when the Republicans become racist. It's like, yeah, Republicans would strongly disagree with you on that, but that's when you see the people who are more opposed to the civil rights movement of the 60s and 70s, you start to see those people change from Democrat to Republican. And of course, in the modern era, neither party wants to claim racist, and you know, who can blame them? So yeah, oh goodness, history does repeat itself, and then yeah, no, everything gets, yeah, it's confusing. It is. So, but the reason that African American voters in the North switched to the Democrats in the 1930s have to do with the New Deal, which sometimes the New Deal policies will help African Americans. Sometimes they don't. Sometimes they discriminate against them. But FDR has a lot of African American advisors in ways that other presidents haven't. And if you're looking for presidents who seem to favor equality, you've got Lincoln, who, I mean, is going to stand out. And then you'll have Teddy Roosevelt, and then Taft, but no one cares about Taft, but Teddy Roosevelt. And then kind of FDR, but he's got Great Depression and World War II as his major things. But then you see Harry Truman, who no one should expect to be that way, as that way. And then the next president, see, I wouldn't say that Eisenhower is, but there's a fairly big event that you could ascribe to him that really does make a difference. But the next one really is LBJ. LBJ, I know you're thinking JFK, and he's toward the end, yeah, but you know, but LBJ, but LBJ's got Vietnam that makes him look bad. So, okay, I need to get back to the stuff. So I'm sorry. Yes, Lyndon Johnson, yeah, and he's, dang, that dude's a mess too. But you'll like some of his civil rights stuff. Some other stuff you go like, dude, what were you thinking? He wasn't sure either. Okay, back to business. I am so sorry. I got super excited there about stuff. Okay. So the South, Black codes, okay. The North wants former slaves to vote. The KKK does not. Part of the reason the KKK forms, part of the reason is to restrict the freedom, liberties, voting rights of former slaves. And I always get backwards. I think they started in Georgia because there's a monument to them near Stone Mountain. But the Nathan Bedford Forrest, the guy who I think is one of the guys who started it, he's from Tennessee. But it's a Southern thing. It's going to be very popular in the South and the Midwest. And, you know, they're going to argue, even in their early days, that their goal is really to preserve America, Southern culture, that sort of stuff. Now, in the early days of Reconstruction, everybody saw the Klan as a big racist group, and we, the US, again, I wasn't there, passed the Force Acts or the KKK Acts so that governors could call in the military to suppress the KKK, especially during elections. As time went along and the Democrats and Republicans become kind of the same party in the late 1800s, the KKK, of course, they're not really necessary, if that sounds so terrible. They don't really need to be active during the Gilded Age because they're nobody in the South that's trying to protect rights of African Americans, and the federal government isn't doing it. So you see them really active right after the Civil War and during Reconstruction. And you see them really active again in the Progressive era, 1920s, a little bit during the Great Depression. And then you see them active again after the Civil War. Yeah, okay. But they formed during this time period, and the federal government suppresses their activity until you see Reconstruction end. And of course, Andrew Johnson gets impeached. I don't say, of course, like we should expect it, although you should, but I assume that you know. He's the first president to be impeached, although not twice. And he gets impeached for primarily political reasons. He keeps vetoing stuff that Congress passes. Congress gets irritated with him. He comes in and cusses them out from time to time. They get irritated with that. But he's not breaking any laws. So they pass a law that they know he'll break, something called the Tenure of Office Act. And it says that he can't fire any of his cabinet members without Senate approval first. And he would argue they're not his cabinet members, they're Abraham Lincoln's cabinet members. So when he wants to fire the last one is when they passed the Tenure of Office Act. It was Edwin Stanton, who was Secretary of War, I believe it was. We don't have that anymore, Secretary of Defense now. So when he was about to fire Edwin Stanton, they passed this law. He figures, he of course doesn't sign, he vetoes it. They override the veto. He figures that's a stupid unconstitutional law, which it probably is unconstitutional. Fires Edwin Stanton anyway, and the Congress goes, it's on, you're impeached. So it goes through the House very quickly, and the Senate holds the trial. And Senate Republicans, who were in the vast majority, they need a 2/3 vote. And if every Republican voted, they would have had almost 3/4. So this should be a no-brainer. He should get impeached, which means they can assess whatever penalty they want, kick him out, whatever they think is appropriate. The Senate Republican leadership talks to Andrew Johnson's lawyers. It's the last year of his term. They say, look, he's not going to run again, and he'll calm down if you just agree to not vote to kick him out, to not vote for conviction. So 6 Republicans, I think it's the exact number they needed, agreed not to vote. And, they just kind of let his term expire. So he gets impeached, but not convicted. And if you're confused about impeachment, I know recent news doesn't help you at all, but a few presidents have been impeached. None have been convicted. Yeah. And I know you're going like, no, Nixon. It's like Nixon actually wasn't fully impeached because he resigned. And thanks for the 5-minute warning. Thanks. Wow. Okay. No, that's good to know though. Because I get too excited. So the guys who were impeached were Johnson, Clinton. They started to impeach Nixon, but he resigned. I mean, they got halfway through. They got to the House. They were about to have the trial in the Senate, and he goes like, I'm out. Mostly because the Republicans said, we're going to convict you, right? And he goes, okay. So Johnson, Nixon halfway, but not completely. So not Nixon. Clinton, and then of course Trump, 1.5, 2, I don't know, because they'll do the trial or they won't. We'll see. All right. So Johnson's out, and then you end up with 2 terms of Ulysses S. Grant, which I clearly don't care about because I didn't write too much about Grant. So no offense if you're a big Grant fan. And we may kind of pick up a little bit on grant and reconstruction, the bargain of 1877, which ends Reconstruction. We'll start with that next time, but Johnson gets impeached, but not convicted. Yeah, impeached, but not convicted. Grant becomes president. He gets elected twice. We'll talk about Grant more next time. The Force Act's used more in the first term, not in the second. Excuse me. And what you start to see in the Grant administration, is declining support for the enforcement of the 13th or 14th and 15th Amendments. And the Supreme Court is also going to rule during the Grant administration that states don't have to enforce those slaughterhouse cases and some other things as well. All right, thanks for the 5-minute warning. So before we stop, let me check a couple things. One, do you guys have any questions? I know I went on about stuff. Yeah, I'm gonna stop.